Okay. The course title, of course, is Text for Critical Analysis. We will talk today about The Picture of Dorian Gray, written by Oscar Wilde. The Picture of Dorian Gray is a Gothic and philosophical novel by Oscar Wilde. It was first published complete in the July 1890 issue of Lippincott's Monthly Magazine. The novel is classified as a Gothic genre. And by Gothic, I mean the style of writing that's characterized by fear, by death, by gloom, as well as by romantic elements such as nature, individuality, and very high emotions. These emotions can include fear and suspense. The novel is about an attractive Englishman's image, which is captured in a painting that keeps him from aging. When he exchanges his soul for eternal beauty, but for every sin that he commits, his image in the portrait begins gradually to become ugly till it reaches the form of the devil. Now, let's shift to some information about the writer himself, Oscar Wilde. Oscar Wilde was born in 1854 when Queen Victoria reigned over Britain. He was a great Irish poet and dramatist. And pay attention that Oscar Wilde has always been characterized as a poet and a dramatist, not a novelist, because The Picture of Dorian Gray is the only novel written by him. Wilde was renowned for his dramatic portrayals of the human condition during the Victorian era in London. His short stories, plays, and poems inspired a great number of people in Victorian England. The prosperity in the Victorian era began to decline in the late 19th century. Under the superficial vanity of the British society lies the corruption of the aristocracy. They led a dissolute life, and their values and moral beliefs began to vanish. In other words, hedonism took the place of the respectable lifestyle they used to live. And we have defined hedonism before in our lecture when we say that hedonism means behaving in ways that mean you get as much pleasure out of life as possible, according to the belief that the most important thing in life is to enjoy yourself. Oscar Wilde was born to be a spokesman of this era in the field of literature, of course. He was one of the late Victorian writers. So let's shift now to the question, what are the main characteristics of Victorian literature? Let's start with the definition of Victorian literature. Victorian literature signifies literature written during the rule of Queen Victoria, which ranges from 1837 to 1901. As it's quite evident from the title, it's the kind of literature that evolved during the reign of Queen Victoria, of course. This literature was preceded by Romanticism and was followed by Modernism or Realism. Hence, one can argue that it can be considered a fusion of romantic and realist style of writing. In other words, it forms a link and a transition between the writers of the Romantic era and the very different literature of the 20th century. The literature of this era expressed the fusion of pure romance to gross realism. The age is also remarkable for the excellence of its prose. Science has influenced the literature of the age, so if you study all the great writers of this era, you will mark four general characteristics. These characteristics can be summed up as follows. Number one, literature of this age tends to come closer to daily life, which reflects its practical problems and interests. Number two, moral purpose. The Victorian literature seems to deviate from art for art's sake and asserts its moral purpose. Number three, idealism. It's often considered as an age of doubt. The whole age seemed to be caught in the conception of man in relation to the universe with the idea of evolution اللي هي فكرة التطور أو نظرية التطور عند داروين. So this age is always characterized as an age of doubt. The age is also characterized as practical and materialistic. So, how all these characteristics resonate on the style of the Victorian novel? The novels of this age mostly had a moral strain in them, with a belief in the innate goodness of human nature. The characters were well-rounded, and the protagonist usually belonged to a middle-class society. But pay attention that this is not the case or the whole case in the picture of Dorian Gray, because in this novel, Dorian Gray was portrayed or characterized as being from an upper-class society. Victorian novels also tend to be idealized portraits of difficult lives in which virtue wins out in the end, and wrongdoers are suitably punished. They tend to be with a central moral lesson at heart. While this formula was the basis for much of earlier Victorian fiction, the situation became more complex as the century progressed. Okay? Here comes the question, how does this information apply to the picture of Dorian Gray? And this question will be answered in our forthcoming lecture, God willing, okay? But you have now a video and I want you to watch this video. It tells about the introduction or tells about some information about the Victorian era and its characteristics and how these characteristics are presented in the Victorian novel. Okay. انا هقفل دلوقتي شير سكرين اللي معمول عندكم وهرجع افتحه من اول وجديد تاني علشان الصوت بتاع الفيديو يوصل لكم.
This video is an introduction to the Victorian era, the next era of our timeline, and be sure that you're taking notes on your notes template so that you'll be ready to send those to Canvas. First, we'll talk about the years. We generally say that the Victorian era started in the 1830s, and that's because Victoria became Queen of England in 1837, but the Romantic period ends right about here at the beginning of the 1830s. And then we'd say that the Victorian era lasts until 1901, the year of Queen Victoria's death. Queen Victoria, it's important to know, lived a very frugal and prudent lifestyle. So her whole point was to expand England and take it through a time of growth, and also then to reform it. So we're going to talk a little bit about why Victorian England needed reform in the first place, and then how the literature is going to reflect some of that reform. We're going to talk about some of the reasons for reform in the Victorian era with 3 fears that the culture possessed. The first would be unrestricted immigration, so the idea that too many people were coming into the boundaries of England without being checked, without being vetted in any way. So there was a fear in the increased levels of crimes and just in the presence of ghetto communities in general. And then to make matters worse, there was this series of murderers by Jack the Ripper in 1888. And basically what he would do, or what they think this one person would do, is slit the throats of prostitutes and then like mutilate their guts, like take out their organs. And most of that happened in a Jewish ghetto in London. And so the idea was, well, if that can happen, then obviously we're having much higher levels of crime and these ghetto communities are to be feared. So by 1905, we had something called the Aliens Act of 1905, and that placed restrictions on immigration from Eastern Europe. So you'll see that the Victorian era is an effort to kind of purify Victorian society, even with this rise in immigration. The second fear is physical and moral decay, and particularly a fear of sexually transmitted diseases like syphilis. But really, it was anything that was morally corrupt or considered morally corrupt or perverse, and sexuality was a big part of that. We talked about the criminal aspect of corruption with the immigration and stories like Jack the Ripper. But we'll talk about this idea of sexual morality or sexual decay as we get into Dracula and the picture of Dorian Gray. The third fear came in towards the end of the Victorian era, and we're going to call that the, quote, new woman. And basically, that would be describing any women who were taking advantage of educational and employment opportunities that became available, or just in general breaking from some of these restraints that were imposed upon them by the male-dominated society. And that was truly something to be feared, because all of a sudden you had women who were becoming educated and asking for the right to vote and doing something that really they had never been done before, and nobody really expected them to ever want to have any more say in their society. So stemming from all these fears was the general drive for social advancement and reform. So we'll reform all of the moral decay that we see happening within our society, and then we'll advance Victorian society and advance Victorian England so that it is really a major world power. The first way they would do this is through industrialization and technological advances. So notice that both of these are very much continuing on from the Romantic period. We talked about scientific advances, and we talked about the growing middle class and the common man, and that continued into the Victorian era. And even more so, we started to define social classes. So the upper class was continuing to be very wealthy with their inherited wealth. There's a growing middle class due to industrialization, and the lower class is still certainly the working class. Second would be the reform of morality and values, as we've started talking about. So severe punishment for crimes to try to, disencourage people from actually committing crimes. Sexual repression and modesty. We're still going to see a lot of sexualized language in the literature that we're going to read, but as a way to prevent any sexually transmitted diseases or to prevent people from being too promiscuous or perverse, we're going to see a lot of requests for sexual modesty. That kind of plays into strict social rules that we would have seen, and then this concept of dignity and restraint. So valuing people who are able to restrain some of these, maybe like physical or human urges. And then finally, number 5 is a patriarchal family structure. So very stereotypical of the man, the father is the head of the household. The women are submissive to him, and the sons become the next heads of the household after the fathers. That's going to play into some of the themes that we see, and I've split it up into the early literature and the later literature. So the early literature of the Victorian era does have this drive for social advancement, and it might be financial advancement, It might be marrying above one's station or one's class and seeing how you can move up through the social ranks. And it could be educational advancement. What's really important to know is that any attempt to improve social standing had to be accompanied by that proper behavior. So everything we've talked about with restraint and being dignified and working with Victorian values, all of that is giving off kind of a snooty vibe. Like everyone wants to act really proper and really prim and proper so that they can appear like they're from the upper classes and they know how to fix it or fit in and mingle with the upper classes. The later literature is a little bit different though, because this is when you see authors who start to rebel against some of those notions and some of the stereotypical moral codes of conduct. Sometimes it's presented as satire to actually make fun of the prim and proper and dignified Victorian era. And we're going to see this, and we'll talk way more about aestheticism when we get to Oscar Wilde and when we start reading The Picture of Dorian Gray. The idea is basically art is art's sake, and if I like it and you don't, that doesn't matter. It's still art. And if I see a message in it but you don't, doesn't matter. It's still art. So we're just making art based on what we feel and not because it has to say something. Finally is the genres of the Victorian era. The novel became a big source of entertainment for British people. It would pick up a novel, kind of, I would say kind of similar to how movies are today. And you saw a lot of romance novels like Pride and Prejudice. And if you think about it, the upper class women were the ones staying at home. So a long novel would be a good way to keep occupied for the day. And then Gothic and supernatural, just like Frankenstein, and definitely in the same vein. And we're going to read Dracula and The Picture of Dorian Gray. And then we'll also read this poem, Ulysses, by Alfred Lord Tennyson. And those were really the two major genres of the Victorian era that you'll certainly study when you get to college as well. So that's all I've got for you. Be sure you have your notes template filled out and then submit it to Canvas. And let me know if you have any questions at all.
Okay. So from this video, one can deduce that the literature of the Victorian era entered a new phase after the Romantic Revival. Okay, as we said before, it was preceded by Romanticism and was followed by Modernism or Realism. It can be called a fusion of Romantic and Realist style of writing. And it tend to be idealized portraits of difficult lives in which hard work, in which love and luck win out in the end. They were usually inclined towards being of improving nature with a central moral lesson at heart. Okay, now I will enable you to unmute your mics if you have any question. اوكي، في اي حد عنده اي سؤال؟ ممكن نفتح المايكس بتاعتنا دلوقتي لو في اي حد عنده اي سؤال. في حد عنده اي تعليق؟ طيب again حد يفتح المايك بتاعه ويأكد لي ان صوت الفيديو كان واضح وان الباوربوينت كان واضح معاه.
كل حاجة واضحة يا دكتور، ما تقلقيش.
طيب اوكي ماشي هناك. طيب بالنسبة لبكرة ان شاء الله في المحاضرة بتاعتنا ان احنا هنشتغل في ال first chapter of the novel. هنقرا ال first chapter. عايزاكم تحضروا قراءة من صفحة 10 لصفحة 20. الريدنج بتاعنا هيكون بطريقة الرول بلاينج جيم، بمعنى ان انا هختار شخصين. تمام. هي دي الشخصيات which are introduced in the first chapter، اللي هو هنري واتن and باسل هاورد. هم هيطلعوا يقروا الناريشن اللي الشخصيات دي بتقوله، وانا هقرا الباك جراوند بتاع الشابتر ده. Okay, it will be a form of interactive storytelling إن شاء الله. اوكي. بالنسبة لي الامتحان بتاع الميد تيرم، لو في أي حد حابب إن هو يسأل عنه، فأنا صححته. تمام. وفي كتير جدا منكم جايبين الفول مارك، ما تقلقوش. اوكي. لو ما في أي حد عنده أي سؤال. تمام. طيب بالنسبة للميعاد بتاع المحاضرة الأونلاين، تمام بالنسبة لكم ولا تحبوا إن احنا نأخره شوية؟
نأخره شوية يا دكتور.
نأخره شوية، نخليه الساعة 12. تمام.
ممكن، ماشي، ممكن، تمام.
خلاص، يبقى إن شاء الله أنا هبلغ دكتور سعيد علشان يغير الميعاد في الجدول الأونلاين، وهنبدأ بعد كده إن شاء الله المحاضرة نخليها من 12 ل1:30 إن شاء الله. احتمال يكون في محاضرة أونلاين ليكوا يوم الجمعة، مش أكيد. لو هيبقى فيه هبعت لكم على الجروب وهبلغكم بيها، هيتبعت لكم طبعا notification بالميعاد ده لو اديت يوم الجمعة. Okay, thank you for your time and see you tomorrow, God willing. Have a nice day and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.